Hi everyone. So I'm only delighted to start our panel off today with the former president, Miss Mary Robinson, and our young people from the different member youth services. So we have Lee from Carlow, we have Ellen from Galway, Andrea from Kerry, Emma from Kerry also, and then finally we have Josh C from Meath and Josh F from Meath. So today our conversation is really going to be based around climate activism and how the different generations can learn from each other and the ways in which we can make small changes that create bigger impacts. So I myself have been involved in activism for only a few years, and I still feel funny even kind of describing it as activism because I wasn't sure exactly what label to put on it when I first started. So I think, Mary, all of us would love to hear from your perspective how you first got involved in activism, what were like your real driving passions behind everything, and how you see yourself as an activist today.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah, and hello to all of you. As I was saying earlier, I love these intergenerational conversations because they're so much more equal now. We can learn from each other, as I'm sure we'll do in this session. But you've asked a good question about how I got into activism. And I think it was because I have a strong sense of justice. Now, I often joke that my early interest in human rights and gender came from the fact that I was growing up in the west of Ireland in Mayo, the only girl among four brothers, two older than me and two younger than me. So, of course, I had to use my elbows and be interested in gender and human rights. But I did have a strong sense of justice, and I felt that the Ireland I was growing up in was over dominated by a Catholic Church that was very severe on private morality and also very strict with women. And we've learned some of the bad impacts of that even recently. And so I wanted to change that, and I decided to study law. And then I was lucky enough to go to the Harvard Law School. I'm the class of 1968. Imagine that, way back in the last century, 1968. Um, but that was a wonderful year in the United States because during that year, um, my fellow American students were protesting against an immoral war, the war in Vietnam. And Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. And just after I graduated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. But what I kind of took back from that year in Harvard was that young people wanted to be involved, wanted to be at the table, and where they were going to poverty programs in the south of the United States and civil rights programs, some of them very courageously. And I came back with what my future husband called my Harvard humility. But whatever it was what encouraged me then to stand for the Senate in 1969. There were six seats for the university elected by graduates of the two university streams, and I was the Trinity stream, and it was elderly male professors up to then. And when I challenged why not women and why not young people, they said, "Well, if you're mad enough, go ahead." And I got elected then in August 1969 and could take my ideas about activism into being involved in the Senate, being involved in teaching law, being involved in practicing law as a barrister. And that's what I did later.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's so fascinating to really see exactly how it went from small personal passion to do with your childhood into really budding into something that allowed you to create real change for society. I think Lee probably has a question for you now, just coming off everything that you've said. We'd love to hear more.
Well, I remember watching one of your speeches recently in the week, and then I remember watching a speech from Greta Thunberg that someone had sent me, and you both mentioned system change to help climate change. What do you feel about that?
Well, thank you, Lee. I must say I'm a great admirer of Greta Thunberg and lots of climate activists, including now you climate activists that I'm getting to know. Um, we need system change because we need actually to understand, and we need to understand it as we come out of COVID, which is really very serious at the moment, that we don't go back to normal. Normal was not getting us to a safe future. So what do we go back to? We go back to real changes in how we run our society, basically, and that's the system change. We have to move as rapidly as possible out of fossil fuel and into clean energy. And that means clean electricity, apart from, electric cars, and it means also a system change in our habits, which is what we can each contribute to. We need to consume less. We need to change our eating habits. We don't all have to become vegetarians or vegans, but we have to reduce our meat because that's, part of being on track for a good future, and it's also healthier. So that's the good news. And we have to, look at every aspect of what is, part of our lives. And we have good government policies now, which is a welcome change. But it's not just for government; it's for every local authority, it's for every business, it's for every NGO, it's for every youth group, it's for all of us to take stock of how we have to plan that system change and design it so that we live a little bit differently and contribute in the way we can to the bigger issue of Ireland taking its place as a leader, not a laggard, on climate change.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that question. And thank you, Mary, for that really insightful answer. I think it really just highlights exactly what needs to be done going forward, and that there should never be too much burden or onus on one layer of the system, because obviously it has to come from us personally, it has to come from our legislators, it has to come from corporations and big business. So it's just really kind of important that it's highlighted that there's something that all of us can do, and it's a really kind of group effort. Would you like to pose a question to Mary Ellen? I'm sure you have something really interesting to ask her.
Yeah, I just totally agree with what you're saying there, Deborah, that, everything is related to everything. And I suppose COVID-19 and the response around the world proves that where there's a will, we can find a way. So it's trying to change that sort of attitude and mindset, I think. But Mary, I just wanted to ask for some advice, if you don't mind. I'm part of a group, a Youth Work Ireland group in Galway called the Saudi Youth Project. So it literally stands for Sustainable Action Uniting Tanzanian and Irish Youth. So it's a group of us in Galway and a group out in Tanga in Tanzania who are kind of working to kind of mobilise a bit and sort of monitor our local authorities' commitments and actions on climate change. But we're in the early stages still, but we're kind of trying to boost the youth sort of voice in Galway County and City and kind of be engaged in the decision-making process. But it's kind of hard to get your foot in the door. And I don't know, have you any advice just from your own background of how to get politicians engaged, or what's the best way about, I suppose, getting the community engaged? Because even from the local authority point of view, it's so policy heavy and even difficult to understand a lot of the time, let alone be engaged with or even interested in.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ellen. I think that's a really good question, and also the link with Tanzania I love. I paid a state visit there when I was president. I've been there. The last time I was there was with Graça Machel. We were there as elders together, and we were supporting the health reform in Tanzania. We went right out into the countryside. I'm not sure whether we went to Tempa. Is that the district that you're with?
Sorry, we're with a town called Tanga.
Tanga, okay. I'm not sure. I don't think we were there. But in many ways, the issues are not dissimilar. And I'm sure in Tanga, your youth group will have the same problem you have of just getting past the bureaucracy, so-called. So the first thing is to be persistent. Nowadays, I think people do recognize that young people have to be heard. But sometimes you may have to just, make your point a little bit more strongly. You could ask for, cities like Galway are supposed to have plans now to be a green city. Ask what the plan is, or if you know about it, do you have a criticism to make on it? If you don't hear initially, go to the Galway local radio. You have good local radio in Galway. I've been on it. I can't remember now the guy, but there are lots of them. But and go to the local paper, go to the local newspaper, and say, we're a youth group. We want you to help tell our story, and we want answers from Galway. We want to be not only involved, but we have a lot to contribute. We have ideas that we want to contribute.
Thank you. Yeah, sounds good. We'll be persistent.
Yeah.
I love that connection. That's terrific. I'm involved myself in a wider Africa Europe Foundation that has just been established. And it's a great idea that young people would link between Europe and Africa, between Ireland and Africa. I love that. Well done,
Yeah, it's
Galway.
actually an initiative as part of the African Union and the EU. So, and I suppose it just boosts our kind of global citizenship or awareness of the global
Yeah,
South, because I know we kind of get
yeah,
stuck in our own bubble here. So, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Good.
Yeah, that sounds like a really, really fascinating project that you're part of there, Ellen. And I think it's like such a good question that you asked about how exactly are minorities and young people supposed to get into these spaces, because I think there's so many glass ceilings that are still there in our society, whether it's for women, for people of color, for young people, and just kind of having that passion and motivation and going out there, like Mary said, and talking to your politicians and talking to the media and really agitating to make a change. I think that kind of energy and drive is exactly what we need to drive climate justice forward. So thank you so much for that. Would you like to put a question forward there, Ellen? Or not Ellen, I'm so sorry, Andrea. Getting mixed up with all the names.
Yes, I would actually. Thank you. There are so many people out there with different views and opinions, and of course, we have to respect all of that. But how do you deal with people who deny that climate change is a problem?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm kind of asked it quite a bit, and my answer I think has evolved. There are two different kinds of people. The first kind is the sort of person who doesn't really understand the connections, doesn't see that climate is impacting because they haven't heard about it or particularly know about it. And I have a lot of time for spending time with somebody like that to talk it through. And then there's uh, the denial that's funded by very rich, deep pockets, the fossil fuel industry, large corporations that depend on fossil fuel, and they have spent a lot of money muddling the science, paying scientists to mislead us, and also denying. And it's a bit like the tobacco industry. You know the way that the tobacco industry tried to pretend that cigarettes didn't really harm us and so on. Well, we're getting that from the fossil fuel industry as an industry, and that plays out then. And unfortunately, in the United States, it became a very political divide because Trump, when he was president, I love saying that, Trump, when he was president, used to deny. And that gave a kind of license to social media and conspiracy theories and all that rubbish. And therefore, there was a lot more denial. I'm very glad that it's got to the stage where news programs now don't give equal space to those who are saying climate change is real and climate change doesn't exist. That is actually immoral now, because it's not true. It's just not true, and therefore, we shouldn't give that equivalence, as it's called. And more that's happening. But there was a time when it was very frustrating that they somehow, just for the sake of good television, had to have somebody on who would query and deny. And happily, that's really fading away. And I think we are seeing, certainly in this country and in Europe, sadly, the United States is very still polarized. But I think the reality of the fires in California and the flooding elsewhere, in Florida, etc., it's all becoming now hard to deny, unless you're making money out of the denial by extending the use of fossil fuel, which is really what's behind the denial.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's almost kind of reflective of the COVID-19 situation where we have this problem where, there's solutions that are trying to be found and we have these vaccines going forward. And it almost kind of seems like a conundrum where it's like, how do we move forward with solving the problem if there's some people who are still willing to put up their hand and say that the problem doesn't exist. And it kind of really sets us back that couple of paces. So it is really great to see that with the passing of Trump's presidency and America signing back up to the Sustainable Development Goals and to the Paris Agreement, that hopefully the world can kind of move together in one place as one. And it won't so much be about debating whether climate change exists and more so about coming together to find solutions to the actual problem. So that was a really good question
And
about
Deborah,
how to deal with
yeah,
climate change deniers.
yeah, sorry, I
Of
didn't
course,
mean
go
to
ahead.
interrupt you. I thought you were going to pass to another question, but just before you do, it's a point I want to kind of stress. Greta was mentioned earlier, and I mentioned, how impressed I am with the young climate activists, because what they say to us over and over again is listen to the science. And I think COVID is helping there, because we're listening to the health experts. We have to. And we're seeing that they're right in their predictions that unfortunately it'll be so many cases and so many sad deaths in Ireland at the moment. And they say it'll get a bit worse in the next day or two. And we believe them because we know it's based on science. We have to, and you young people have to continue to insist that any politicians stop waffling and listen to and implement the science-based solutions.
Yeah, it's really the only approach that will work going forward, just cutting out all the extra nonsense and just boiling it down to the bare bones and seeing what is fact and what isn't. So for sure. And we might take another question now from Emma.
You seem like you're a very influential person, and I agree with all of your opinions. I was just wondering, when you were younger, did you have any influential people that you looked up to, or that like helped you with, getting to where you are today?
Oh, absolutely. Um, so many. Where do I begin? I suppose, I was influenced by a grandfather who was a lawyer who had to retire because of illness. And he didn't know how to talk to his granddaughter as a child. So he talked to me as an adult. So at the age of 10, 11, 12, he would talk to me about the cases he was involved in. And I know he fed that sense of justice that I had. He had represented small tenants in the west of Ireland who were being evicted by landlords, those kind of cases. And I was very, kind of impressed by all of that. I was impressed by some teachers, but later by reading about some people who had great moral strength. And they included Gandhi, they included Martin Luther King, they included Eleanor Roosevelt, and they influenced me. And then I was lucky to meet some of the great moral leaders in the world before they died. I mean, I'm talking about Nelson Mandela and others like Archbishop Tutu, who is still alive. He's retired from the elders, but I saw him in January last year, and he's such a wonderful, wonderful man, and with such love, etc. Kofi Annan, who died a couple of years ago, and then I took over the chair of the elders from him. These were all very inspirational figures later in life. But the truth is, I mean, I took part in that early election in 1969. I couldn't have done it without so many volunteers. You're always on the shoulders of someone if you're involved in any kind of elected or public position, or indeed any position, I think. And my friend Ivan Boland, who died last year very sadly, wrote a wonderful poem to mark the suffragettes, the 100 years of the getting the Irish vote, the suffragettes in Ireland. And she said, she wrote that poem that, what is it? We are the lives of other women. I've forgotten the title of it now, but because I'm an elder. But it's a wonderful poem, and it pays tribute to those who went before. And artists do this. You get a great player of an instrument, and they will acknowledge who taught them or who they have the instrument from, or it's in our DNA to acknowledge who went before, and we absolutely need to do that. We're all influenced, and it's no harm as young people to actually seek out from time to time some mentorship from people. Just ask them. I'd love to spend a little bit of time with you. I'd like to learn a bit of how you do this so that I can, you know, uh, you know, have more uh, knowledge borrowed from you and learned from you, as we've all done. You know.
That's such an important point. I find myself constantly looking back and looking forward to people who are interested in the same topics as me and thinking to myself, how can I learn from them? How can I build upon what they've done? Whether it's looking at their mistakes and what hasn't gone so well for them and thinking, how can we change that? Or looking at what has gone really well for them and thinking, great, we see that that's working. Let's take that approach, whether it be on campaigning for LGBT issues, and let's use that same kind of strategy to campaign for climate justice and things like that. So
Mm.
it's really so important to have that multi-dimensional approach. And I think even the fact that we have a group of young people here today and we're learning from each other, learning from you, you're hopefully learning a little bit from us. It's just great to have that kind of connectivity between us all.
Yeah,
We
I
might go
think,
to one of the
Deborah.
Josh. Oh yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
if I may, I think just to say, I'm learning from you. Um, I think because we need such uh, transitional change, we need actually systems change, as Greta and I have been talking about. We actually need the kind of innovative energy and imagination of young people. Um, when you're a little bit older, you get used to incremental, doing the same thing, maybe slightly better, but it's not much change. We actually need to be
Mm.
challenged, and young people can play a role, I think, in pushing us to make the changes that will provide a better future and do it quicker than we otherwise would have intended.
Yeah, it's really great to hear that. And I'm sure all of us here feel heartened to hear that kind of response because unfortunately it's not always the universal response from different generations who perhaps might have more power. And I'm sure all of us here have heard before, like, oh, you're only young, don't worry about these kind of things. You can deal with that when you get into your career or into your future. But I mean, I think we all realize the urgency of the climate crisis, and we truly just don't have the time to wait and rest on our laurels and say that we'll deal with that in 5 or 10 or 15 years. So the time to act really is now. So hearing that kind of motivation and that kind of push for it is really, really, really special. So we might go to Josh now for another question.
Hello. So in 2018-19, there was protests, human rights. Our generation is seen to be doing that stuff. However, there's times where people question whether they're being listened to because of their age. What would you say to those people in advice?
Well, I think we learned a lot from the huge commitment of young people in the two referenda in the country on same sex marriage, which was a big step for the country. And what I welcomed very much was that it didn't become an urban rural divide. Every county in Ireland except one voted for the same sex marriage referendum by significant majorities. And when it came to the even more difficult issue of removing the amendment on the abortion issue, it was stunning. I had actually given up on that one. I have to confess. I had argued in the Irish Senate. I did a marathon speech to stop the Oireachtas from introducing that amendment into the Constitution, and I failed. And then, over the years, I would make some efforts, and I thought, no, this is never going to change. No, it's never going to change. But young people didn't give up on that issue, and that was I so admired the fact that there was a determination that this was the human rights issue, as the same-sex marriage had been, and there was a learning across from both referenda. We need now something of a similar kind of mood among young people about the climate crisis, because it's an absolute crisis of all the things that COVID has taught us. COVID has taught us, it has been a kind of mirror exacerbating all the inequalities. So there's a racial inequality. We see it most vividly in the United States, that it's black and brown and indigenous people who are affected more by COVID. But we see it particularly in the developing world with climate. It's the first issue of climate justice that I came across. The second one was the gender dimensions within that, the different social roles, the different power, the different access to credit or access to land rights of women. The third one is the intergenerational injustice. The fourth one is the injustice of the pathways to development. The developed countries built our economies on fossil fuel, and now we want to stop developing countries from using coal and oil and gas. But how can they use clean energy unless they get the investment, the technology, the training, the jobs? And we haven't been showing a solidarity. We have more of a monopoly of the doing of that, but we haven't been sharing it properly with developing countries. And then the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature, the loss of biodiversity. All of these have somehow been connected by COVID, just by exacerbating those inequalities. There are people in Ireland today who are utterly down in every sense possible. It may be that it's an abusive household, and it's poverty, and it's race, and they all together. And then, separately, these are also ways in which some people are so much worse off because of COVID. And, it's these injustices that I think we need to really learn to highlight in a problem-solving way, but almost get out of the silos of racial justice, gender justice, poverty justice. Link all of that and make the circle wider, so that we get climate justice to embrace all of those injustices.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. And I'd never really actually thought about it before, about how all these issues aren't as separate as we thought. And they are a lot more connected. And in order to solve them, you need a much more connected approach. I actually have a question for you myself.
I can tell you that. Sorry, I can tell you, Deborah. I'll tell it very quickly. I learned that quite late on in my life. I was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but I was also the Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism in Durban. And I learned about the word intersectionality. That was the first I heard of it. And it's a great feminist word that connects and that links. Now, COVID has done that for us. It has shown the intersectionality between all the injustices. And that's a great step forward. And we need to highlight it and drive it home.
Yeah, that's so, so important. I remember the first time I came upon that word myself, reading Kimberly Crenshaw and learning about this whole different world that existed outside of my perspective. Really exciting. So, for example, I've been involved with human rights activism and youth work for probably 6 or 7 years now. And you mentioned yourself that...
And you're 20.
I'm turning 19. I'm turning 20, I'm 19. So, yeah. I suppose I dipped my toes in. Yeah, I dipped my toes in quite early on.
That's cool. Okay.
But it really struck me when you mentioned that you remember being in front of the Oireachtas and trying to not allow the amendment to go through, and the fact that you kind of nearly gave up on the issue. So I was wondering if you have any tips for people like us who have been involved in activism for a while now, but are still quite young, and so will continue to be involved with it for quite some time, and how to deal with things like burnout and feeling as if you're not making a change, or feeling as if all your actions are quite tokenistic or airy-fairy. I wonder, would you have any advice for that?
I learned a hard lesson with some of the early activism in the Senate. Some of you may or may not know about this, but I had decided to go forward to try to get elected to the Senate in 1969 because I wanted to reform the law on family planning. We used to joke about it, that married women couldn't get access to contraceptive pills unless they were certified by their doctor that they had cycle regulation problems. And we used to joke that it must be the Irish weather that so many women had cycle regulation problems because they were all, getting the pill. And equally, it wasn't against the law to use a condom, but it was against the criminal law to either buy or sell a condom. And this was in 1970, 1969, 1970, against the criminal law. So I thought, this should be easy to reform because it's so ridiculous. So with two male colleagues, I tabled a bill to reform a criminal law act of 1935. And I got such hate mail, criticism. I was denounced from pulpits. The then Catholic Archbishop of Dublin said this measure, the bill that we had put forward, would be and would remain a curse upon the country. Now, I was 25 when I was elected. I was about 26, maybe going on 27 at the time, and I was quite shaken. It was not nice. I was, I got so upset that my husband, we got married in December 1970, and after that, he burned the hate mail that I got, which we both regret now because it's obviously part of social history, and we're archivists, and yeah, but it was because it was undermining my courage. And then I decided, no, I know this is the right thing to be doing. The law has to change. And so I kind of steadied myself. And never again, I mean, there were other things that I did and got criticism for. And, criticism is what anybody expects in public life. But I was never shaken again. And this was before social media. I mean, I really feel great empathy for those who are trolled and bullied and battered on social media. Hate mail, the snail mail, as we call it now, was bad enough. I had things like garden gloves cut off and sent to me in the post by somebody who signed as a Catholic priest, no name, just a Catholic priest. And, all of this sort of heavy stuff. Sometimes you just need a little bit of courage to keep going, and a little bit of persistence. And if you do manage to get over that first hump, you'll feel good about it. And secondly, probably you'll never have that problem again.
That's really helpful. And I'll definitely take that with me for quite some time. I really appreciate that. Thank you. We might go to you, Josh, now for a question.
Yeah, I suppose in our local communities and in our schools, we find there's lots of inaction. So there's plenty of people who are doing nothing as we're bent to enter a really trying time for climate change and climate justice. But what can we do as young people to help spur action in our local communities?
It's a kind of good question because I think it's more difficult during the COVID time when everything is virtual, and it's easier when you're sitting around looking at each other physically and can plan together how to do something as a youth group. It's more difficult in a virtual time. So take that on board and say, it may be more difficult, but I'm more determined. And, the kind of things you can do. There's a website that a friend of mine operates called Change by Degrees. Her name is Dr. Tara Shine. She's a good scientist, and she worked with me in my foundation on climate justice. And was a consultant to it before we wound up because we had done our work. But she has all kinds of ideas that can be done at a very local level. And, if you start a group on looking at things like recycling more carefully, dealing with waste issues, I do like the link with the local authority. I think, it's not for youth groups to sort of volunteer too much to cure all our bad problems. It's to hold responsible in a good way by saying, we want a healthier, cleaner environment, and we want clean energy. And what's our local authority doing about it? It's holding to account. I think that's the kind of youth work I'm really keen to see, because the burden shouldn't fall on you young people, even though it does. And I mean, Greta knows this, and all the other climate activists in the world know that, the young people, unfortunately, because we're not doing enough, because we failed. My generation failed. The generation after me is failing. Take that on board. So you hold to account those who have opportunities to change, like, having less waste, having more recycling, having cleaner rivers, having less litter, having whatever it takes, I think being able to at least plan for when you can be physically out more is probably a good thing. I do empathize that it's harder when we're in a virtual situation at the moment. but at the same time, we can Zoom as we're doing now. You can plot together and plot well as to how to see good paths forward. Um, Another friend of mine who worked with me in my foundation, Sean McCabe, works for TASC, TASC, on what he calls a people's transition. I know you're probably aware that part of climate justice is just transition, which is just transition for the workers in coal and oil and gas, and in this country, obviously in the bogs and peat. But also there's a people's transition, meaning that we can all decide. And I often talk to audiences about the 3 steps that we can all take, and maybe I'll share those with you. The first step, and I think you've all done this, but you can encourage others. The first step is to make the climate crisis personal in your own life, because it's that important. And you make it personal by doing something today that you weren't doing before. Deciding to do something, deciding to recycle more efficiently, to use less waste, not to buy so many new things, not to buy so much new clothes, whatever it takes, to change your diet, whatever. That's the first thing. The second thing is to get angry with those who have more responsibility and aren't doing what they should be doing. And that's holding to account, and using your voice and your vote, and joining organizations. There are lots of environmental and climate and conservation organizations around that are active, and that helps your climate anxiety, actually. But the last thing, the third step, is the most important. And really, if you can encourage that, you'll be doing a lot of good. And that is to imagine this world we need to be hurrying towards. Because this world has to be a much cleaner world, a much healthier world, because we won't have the fossil fuel that is causing a lot of asthma and deaths, even in Ireland, and a much more equal world, because we won't get the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals. We won't get that implemented by 2030 unless we have the solidarity that it talks about, that we leave no one behind, that we prioritize the furthest behind first. And so unless we can do that, we're not going to succeed in having this better world that has prepared us for, because a lot is broken because of COVID. We haven't got life as it was. We don't want to return to complete business as usual because it wasn't bringing us to a safe world. Now's the chance to introduce non-business as usual as we move back.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mary. That really, really makes a lot of sense. So we have a few minutes left, just over 5. So, Mary, is there anything you might like to ask one of our panelists or our panelists?
Yeah, I'd like to actually hear. I'd like to hear. I think from any of you who are already involved in your youth group. I know the one from Tanzania now. I don't need to go back on that. But what about some other youth groups? That was Galway. What about other youth groups? What are you actually doing that could be useful for me to know?
Here in a Youthquake, we're called Meath. At the moment, we're focusing in on the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to see how in our town in Navan and in Meath as a whole can we push towards these more. So I suppose that's our link to this.
Yes, that's good. And, I'm sure, there are 17 of them. It's complex. But I think you can break it down. And I think we can look at the production and consumption, because there's so much waste. Do you know, I'm not talking about Ireland, I'm talking globally. We waste a third of the food produced in the world. Isn't that shocking? Isn't that just unbelievable? And there are people who are very hungry. And indeed, we see people in the United States now because of COVID who are queuing up for food parcels and food because they're desperately hungry. And yet we waste. Now, I think, in Navan or in Meath generally, there is waste. Do a bit of tracking of that and see if you can, have a group that can address that issue. And then, we all buy too many throwaway things. Thankfully, we're getting very aware of the role of plastic in the food chain and everything. But we need, have you banned single-use plastics? That's another thing. Get rid of the one plastic bottle. Do you all have water bottles?
Yeah.
I see
I think
nodding
that's a
from
common
Galway.
feature now in schools.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
rare to
And I
see
mean,
people with the single-use plastic
schools
bottles.
are good. The schools have done a lot in schools themselves. Especially the schools that have taken it seriously. There's a lot that we can learn from them.
Mary, do you
Is
mind
there
if I
any
Anything else
ask
you
kind
you
can?
of
before we go?
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, you mentioned climate anxiety, and I know I'm sure
yeah.
for us who are engaged in the issue, it's probably a problem, but how do you kind of combat that or kind of stay hopeful? Because it does at times seem like all of our goals are kind of unattainable, and is there really any point trying? Are we just heading towards the abyss now at this stage?
Yeah, I have a different kind of anxiety, but it's there. It's there with me all the time, and it's partly because I'm so lucky. I'm lucky enough to have 7 grandchildren of my 3 children, and they range in age from 17 down to 4 months. So I think a lot about these grandchildren who'll be in their 30s and 40s. I'm not even sure if Hazel, our 4 month old, what age she'll be. I haven't worked it out yet. But they'll have most of their life, as you will have a lot of your life to lead by 2050. And yet it'll be a world where we'll have maybe as many as more than 9, maybe close to 10 billion. It's not clear. Unless we change, how on earth are we going to have enough food, enough water, enough, sort of what kind of jobs, etc. So that's my anxiety, and it helps me to be very active every day on the issue because I'm talking about it all the time. I'm working on it all the time, and that prevents me from sitting and moaning, which I would probably otherwise do. Um, you're in a different stage, and I think it does help actually to be active, to feel that you're playing your role, in whatever way, in order to, because um, we all should be aware that this is a very difficult time in the span of humanity. Um, I've heard it said, I mean, Ban Ki-moon used to say this as Secretary General a lot, that we're the first generation to understand the danger of climate change and the last generation with time to do something about it. And that time is getting shorter. I mean, we really have to be in a different place by 2030 so that we're at zero carbon and zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in order to have a world which may be a bit worse than it is now, because we've put so much stuff up. Unless we can find ways to capture carbon, which we're also working on, take carbon out of the atmosphere, which is expensive, but more and more focus is going on that. And we need the nature-based solutions. Nature is a wonderful ally in dealing with climate, and we need to respect and love nature more, and biodiversity. We haven't maybe spoken about that enough for youth groups. Work on nature-based solutions. Think of tree planting. Think of that approach as well as part of your youth work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really great. I think it's a really kind of powerful note to end on, that the most important thing we can do is to stay active and to kind of keep the fight and the passion alive. And I think personally, if I take anything from this, it'll definitely be that and so much more. So we are also grateful to you for giving us your time today, and it's been such a productive, insightful conversation. And thank you so much to the young people and to the panelists for your questions. I learned so much and have taken away so much from this, and hopefully you all have too.
And thank you, Deborah. I feel very energized as well. As I said, I love the intergenerational discussion and the way we've had it, kind of sharing with each other and learning from each other. And it's great to know that young people in Ireland are stepping up. We need you. So
Yeah.
step up.